In today's video, I'm going to be talking about global migration and how it's become more complex in the 21st century. This is for the OCR A-Level Geography spec. There are quite a lot of bullet points here, and I'm only going to cover two of them. So I'm going to look at economic globalization and how that's created new source areas and destinations. And I'm also going to talk about how the corridors from south to south and south to north have equalized a little bit. So the first bit I'm going to talk about is how we've seen an increase in south to south migration. Historically, since the kind of post-war era from the 60s onwards, we would have seen a very familiar pattern of international migration. So people would have moved from countries in the global south, that's in this area that is coloured in red, to the global north. So Europe, North America, but also places like Australia and New Zealand. However, this has started to change. What we started to see at the start of the 21st century is the flows of migration from south to south have increased significantly and are now equal to the ones that were happening on that traditional south to north. So if I look at the picture on the left here, I can see that south to south migration, when this was taken in 2019, was about 97 million people are doing that, which is really similar to what south to north was, which is 89. Again, significantly more than the other types of migration happening north to north or north to south, but we can see that they're actually very similar in terms of percentage of overall international migrants. If I actually even look on this south to south migration versus south to north over time, I can see that there's actually a point just after 2010 where south to south migration in terms of overall numbers actually starts to outstrip south to north. We can say that year on year out, though, at the moment they are roughly a similar percentage, and they're now about equal. In terms of an actual example, here's some actual evidence to show that this is happening in real life. India has lots of people leaving India to go on to different places, and traditionally lots of those people would have gone to the north, to places like America. And America still is a really important destination for Indian migrants. However, this was taken in the last 2 years. We can see that most of the other places that they're going to are in the global south. So places like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and overall, out of those top 5 or 6 south locations, more Indian migrants are going from India in the south to another south country rather than to a north country like the USA. And I put some figures there on the right to give us some AO1 knowledge off the back of that. Why is this change happening in our pattern though? Why is this happening in the 21st century? So one of the reasons is it's actually harder to get into the north than it used to be. This can be because of physical barriers that have been created, like this barrier fence that's been created on the Hungary and Serbian border to stop migrants coming in from Afghanistan and further east, or coming up through the Mediterranean route. But also we've got political barriers. These are barriers, again, that are discouraging people from the south to migrate to the north. Again, I've used Hungary here as a really contentious place, where in Hungary the PM actually passed a law that meant that if any lawyers or activists tried to help any asylum seekers actually seek asylum in Hungary, then you could go to jail for up to a year. So that is a political barrier that stops migrants going, because they know that there will be conflict if they try to get into that country, and it would also discourage anyone in Hungary from actually trying to help them. This was, again, a law that was contravened EU law, so it was a really controversial moment at the time. In the same country, they also even hired these people called border hunters. So they would be normal citizens that were there to help the police patrol that borderline, track down any migrants, and essentially kick them back across the fence, back into Serbia. So these are really significant political barriers that would people would find out about, and therefore discourage them from going from that global south to places like Hungary, which would be considered in the global north. The other two main reasons are more positive. So there is greater awareness via social media and better communications like mobile phones that mean that people can find out about opportunities in south countries before they go. They can find out about really clear routes to go from migrants who have already been, and therefore it's not only is it safer, but there's more opportunities when they actually get there, so they're more likely to do that route. The other thing is financial. It costs a significant more amount of money to actually go to the north because you have to go a longer distance often. But if it's a neighbouring country that has opportunities, then that would be a reason why people would go to a neighbouring country rather than spending a lot of money, potentially all your savings, to take the risk of going to a global north country. The other kind of major reason I'm going to focus on now is the fact that globalization has actually created more economic opportunities in the south, and therefore people are more likely to stay in the south. So globalization has meant that all of the economies of the world have become more interconnected and interdependent on each other. So they rely on each other for different things, and that can include migrants and labour. So we still have those historic connections that have been there forever, and I've used the example of Brazil and Portugal. That's been established corridor of migration both ways since the 19th century. But because we're starting to see growing economies in the south, in lots of Africa and lots of Asia, then we're starting to actually see that there are new source countries which are producing migrants and new destinations where people want to migrate to because there has become new opportunities. So the global forces, shifting of industry and manufacturing to new bits of the world have meant there have been new opportunity areas, and therefore there are new places for people to go to. And Brazil could be an example of that, where even though it's got that historic connection with Portugal, as its industry has grown, it has become a destination for countries nearby it, like Paraguay and like Bolivia, and those would therefore they will become source countries, and Brazil will become the new destination country. One of these examples is the fact that really high skilled workers from China, India and also Brazil, kind of people that are working in those quaternary and service sectors, are now migrating to the USA because they have the opportunity for higher salaries and a higher quality of life. Good example here on the diagram to the left is showing that on that temporary visa for really high skilled visas, there's a really high demand for Indian talent. There's lots of very well educated Indian migrants, and therefore they are high in demand in America. Lots of them are therefore moving. We can see kind of other examples on a more localized scale. So here we can see in Asia and Western Asia, we can see that there's lots of migration from countries like India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, but also Egypt to what we call the Gulf states, so United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. And these are often because in those countries there is a growing economy, so there's more jobs in construction and oil production. They're very high oil producing countries. So people are going there because there are not only higher wages, but the fact is they're right nearby. So there are very few obstacles. It's much easier to get to the UAE or Saudi Arabia than have to go and travel to get to the global north. We can also see that there is more complex changes happening in Europe. So lots of EU migrants who have gone to places like Denmark and Germany and the UK are now returning home to their countries. Here's some of the major countries where people are returning to, so Poland, Portugal, Romania, Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia. It varies the amount of people that are actually going back depending on the country. In the example of Romania, nearly 93% of people that migrated away are returning, where in Estonia it's only 58%. And the reason why these people are starting to return is because they've gone away for a couple of years, they've met their economic goals, often by doing maybe lower skilled jobs than they would in their native country, earned really good higher wages, and now they're returning with savings to establish a new life back for them in their own country. Another example of why we might see more complexity in movement is the fact that we've got political changes. So, for example, the UK had Brexit and left the EU, so that might discourage some EU migrants from actually migrating to there. But we can see that on the graph here after the Brexit referendum, that the amount of people that were moving to the UK for economic work-related reasons has almost pretty much halved. But it also, anybody that's already a migrant that's gone to that country might actually be encouraged to move on because they don't feel as welcome there. So we can see that there are lots of factors that can have changed the patterns that we might see in terms of migration. Some other examples of what we would call intra-regional, so within a region, migration. We see in South America lots of movement to what we call the Southern Cone, so Argentina and Chile, from countries nearby like Paraguay and Bolivia. Those are countries that have lower wages, and therefore they would go to Argentina and Chile for economic opportunities. Similarly, growing economies in Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, they become new destinations for migrants, while the source countries are again nearby Laos, Myanmar and Cambodia. So the obvious reason that for most of the people moving here is that the economies are growing, and therefore there are lots of opportunities and higher wages. But also we've got to consider the fact is that there is also freedom of movement. So in Mercosur in South America, but also in ASEAN, there is freedom of movement in those trading blocks. So not only are people moving for the money, but the fact they can move much easier because there are no visas and restrictions on their actual movement between those countries. Last thing to consider is we've looked about new sources and destinations, and we've looked at an international level, we looked at an intra-regional level, but we need to look internally as well. As economies grow because of globalization in EDC, so China, Mexico, India, Brazil, and the example I've got here is in China, we start to see lots of investment, foreign direct investment from big TNCs and urban areas, and that means there are more job opportunities in those areas. This therefore causes lots of people within that country to migrate, so from rural areas to urban areas. And so if you look at China here, we've got a general movement towards the east here, towards that southeast where all the economic investment has happened. And so places like in the west, like Tibet, become lot older, and they lose all their young population who move to the east. This is not necessarily a new pattern, but it's still a really important pattern to know in terms of new destinations and new sources of migrants.